Johnny Tremain, A Story of Boston in Revolt by Esther Forbes. When at last he blew his last lamp, Johnny had made an exact replica of the winged woman, only larger. He looked at it and knew that it was not, for some reason, quite right. Instead of going up to the attic to sleep, he crossed into the kitchen and got an old mattress. The clock struck midnight, and he was asleep. He woke, and it was still dark. Someone was in the room with him, and he thought of thieves. "Who's there?" he yelled roughly. "It's me, Johnny. I wasn't going to wake you up if you were already asleep, but what's wrong, Cilla?" Cilla. "Johnny, it's Isana. She's sick again." "What does her mother say?" Cilla began to cry. "I don't want to tell her. She just say, poor baby, wasn't worth raising." Johnny was tired. At the moment, he had a sneaking sympathy with Miss Latham's point of view. "What seems to be wrong?" "She's hot. She says if she can't get a breath of air, she'll throw up." This was a very old but dire threat. "There might be a little down in the end of the wharf. Fetch her down." Seemed it was always like this. Whenever things went wrong and he was tired, Cilla was after him to help her nurse Isana. Nevertheless, he carried her in his thin, strong arms. She was a tiny child for 8. The white gold hair that he secretly admired so much got into his mouth, and he wished she was bald. Isana giggled. On one side of the deserted wharf were warehouses. On the other were ships. Not a person was abroad except themselves. The child grew heavier and heavier. "Want to walk now, Isana? You'd be cooler walking." "I like to ride." "Well, just so you are satisfied." "Johnny," said Cilla crossly, "are you being sarcastic to baby?" "Yes." "How do you feel, dear?" "I feel like I'm going to throw up." "Oh, you get down then," said Johnny. That settles it. But he carried her to the very end of the wharf. Suddenly he felt cool fingers of air lifting the wet, fair hair on his forehead. The perspiration under his arms dripping down his chest evaporated, and the prickly sensation was delightful. Isana cried, the wind, blow, wind, blow." It did not blow, but flowed over them and cooled them. The 3 sat in a row, their feet dangling over the water below. They sat well apart at first, with arms outstretched, soaking themselves in the freshness of the sea air. For a long time they sat and said nothing. Then Isana put her head in Cilla's lap. Cilla leaned against Johnny. The 2 girls were almost asleep. Johnny was wide awake. "Johnny," murmured Isana. "Johnny," murmured Isana, "tell us a story." "I don't know any." "Johnny," said Cilla, "tell us the story of your middle name." "It isn't a story, it's just a fact." "What is it?" Although by daytime, and if Cilla had teased him, he never would have told. The darkness of the night, the remoteness of the place where they sat, an affection he felt for the girls, and they for him, made everything seem different. After a long pause, he said, "It is light, Lyte. "So you are really John Light Tremain?" "No, my baptized Bible name is Jonathan. I've always been called Johnny. That's the way my papers were made out to your grandpa. I am Jonathan Light Tremain." "Why, that's just like Merchant Light." "Just like." "You don't suppose you're related?" "I do suppose, but I don't know. Light's not a common name, and we're both Jonathan. Of course I've thought about it. Some. When I see him rolling around in his couch, strutting about with his laces and gold-headed canes. But I don't aim ever to think too much about it." Isana was almost asleep. Tell more, Johnny," she murmured. "Merchant Light is so very rich." How rich? Like Mr. Hancock? Oh, not quite. Almost. He's so rich, gold and silver are like dust to him. You mean at Light Mansion, Miss Light sweeps up gold and silver in her dustpan? Mrs. Light doesn't sweep, you silly, not with her own fair hands. For one thing, she's dead, and for another, if she weren't, she'd just snap her fingers and maids would come running in frilly starched caps. They'd curtsy and squeak, "Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. If it please you, ma'am." And then Mrs. Light would say, "You dirty sluts, look at that gold dust under the bed. I could write my name in the silver dust on the mirror over the mantel. Fetch your mops and rags, you bow-legged, cross-eyed, trattering monkeys." Diamonds, too? To clean up diamonds, they need brooms. Oh, Johnny, tell more. Once the rubies spilled, and the cook, a monstrous fine woman, I've seen her, thought they were currants. She put them in a fruitcake, and Merchant Light broke a front tooth on one. A fact, Johnny? Well, it's a fact that Merchant Light's got a broken front tooth. I saw it as I stood watching him. Scylla said, "You watch him much." He answered, a little miserably, "It's just like I can't help it. I don't mean ever to think of him." Isana murmured, What do they do with their pearls?" "They drink their pearls." "What?" "Like a queen of Egypt my mother told me of. Before she died, she drank her pearls in vinegar just to show off. That Lavinia Light is always showing off too." Isana was asleep. "You never speak of your mother, Johnny. She hadn't been dead more than a few weeks when you first came here. You never talked about her at all. Was that because you liked her so much, or not at all?" There was a long pause. "Liked her so much," he said at last. "We had been living in Townsend, Maine. She got a living for us both by sewing. But when she knew she had to die, she had death inside of her and she knew it. She wanted me taught skilled work, and all I wanted was to be a silversmith. That's why we came to Boston, so's to get me a proper master. She could still sew, but she coughed a lot all the time. Even when she was so weak she could hardly hold a needle, she kept on, teaching me reading and writing and all that. She was determined I shouldn't grow old untaught, like Dove and Dusty. She wanted me to be something." "That's why you work so hard?" "That's why. Mrs. Laffan promised my grandpa would take me on Mrs. Laffan promised your grandpa would take me on just as soon as she was buried. She died and he did. That's all." "What was her name? And how come she, a poor sewing woman, was so well learned?" "Round about here she called herself just Mrs. Tremain, but she was born Lavinia Light. She came of gentlefolk, just like Mr. Light's daughter." "Just like Mr. Light's daughter?" "Yes. She told me once, for over 100 years, Lights have favored Jonathan and Lavinia as names." "Johnny, didn't she ever go to those rich relatives and say, 'Here I am'?" "No, and she told me not to, ever. Unless only if I'd got to the end of everything. She'd say, 'Johnny, if there is not one thing left for you, and you have no trade and no health, and God himself has turned away his face from you, then go to the Merchant Light and show him your cup, and tell him your mother told you before she died that you are kin to him. He will know the kinship,' she said, 'and in pity he may help you.'" "Your cup?" "Yes, she said I wasn't to sell it, ever. I was to go hungry and cold first." "Where's your cup?" "In my sea chest in the attic. That's why I keep it locked." "Will you show me your cup?" "If you swear by the hope of heaven and your fear of hell never to mention any of this to anyone, never tell my true name, nor that I have a cup." "But Isana—" If she's heard anything, she'll think it was a story I made up, like those rubies in the fruitcake. Now it was close to morning. Far off a cock crew. Nearby another answered. The dawn breeze came up from off the sea, and the black night turned gray. Scylla was shivering and stood up. Johnny shouldered Isana. He kept his word to Scylla, and as he was putting the little girl back to bed, he slipped to the attic, unlocked his chest, and brought down the cup in a flannel bag his mother had made. He opened the door from the shop to the wharf. Although still dark inside the house, outside it was growing lighter and lighter. Gulls flew in from the islands looking for food. Scylla joined him, and he motioned her to follow him out into the twilight of the new day. He drew his cup from its bag. As a small child, he had thought it was the most beautiful thing in the world. It was the reason why he had begged his mother to apprentice him to the silversmith, and there were none in Townsend, Maine. Now he was more critical of the cup. He thought it too chunky. On one side was engraved the crest of the lights. This was an eye rising from the sea. This was an eye rising up from the sea. From its rays of light, or lashes, streamed out, half covering the surface of the cup. It was this emblem Merchant Light had on everything he owned, carved above his counting house on Long Wharf, engraved on all his silver, even on dog collars and harnesses. Excuse me. Miss Lavinia had it stamped on her Spanish leather gloves. Johnny knew it was cut out the gravestones. Johnny knew it was cut on the slate gravestone of the Light family on Copp's Hill. The same as his, said Scylla in wonder. And the same motto, too. Look. She read the words in her halting manner. Let there be light. And miraculously she had stumbled over these words. There was light, for the sun came up out of the sea. The children stood and looked at each other. The girl's face showed her excitement and her fatigue. It was a pointed, sweet little face, her eyes a lighter brown than Isana's, and her hair not so strikingly pale. Johnny whispered, just like the sun coming up in yonder out of the sea, pushing rays of light ahead of it. Scylla, evidently thinking Johnny was getting beyond himself, said, might it not just as well be a setting eye? It was the first sour remark she had made to him all the night. No, my mother said it is a rising eye, but I was to keep whist and mum about it, unless even God had turned away his face. And Scylla, you promised, by my hope of heaven and my fear of hell. The end of Part 5, Chapter 1, Part 5.